Great, I think we will get going. Colleagues, friends, partners, I warmly welcome you to today's event. I am Olivia Rope and I'm the Executive Director of Penal Reform International, and I'll be moderating the next hour and a half or so at this event today. For those of you who do not know PRI, we are a non-governmental organisation, an NGO working globally to promote criminal justice systems that uphold human rights for all and do no harm. And for 30 plus years now, we have promoted practical reform of criminal justice systems to bring about systematic and comprehensive change. So welcome to all of you. A couple of things to start off the session. We invite all of you to put through any questions that you have for the panel through the Q&A function, or you can use the hashtag Global Prison Trends on Twitter, and I'll do my very best to get some of these answered. The webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on our website, our social media channels and YouTube if you want to listen back on anything, or of course share with others. We have Spanish interpretation today, so if you would prefer to listen in Spanish, you can choose this in the interpretation box, the globe at the bottom of the screen. So today we meet to launch our flagship publication, Global Prison Trends 2021, which is published together with our partners at the Thailand Institute of Justice, as it has been for the past 5 years. We've published this report annually since 2015. And this year, it details what has happened over the past year with all of the challenges in light of COVID-19 for prisons, and also touches on issues for probation systems. It has a special focus section looking at prisons in crises, such as in fragile and conflict settings, and also when natural hazards or natural disasters hit. It's available on our website and we will share the link, but it's on our homepage at penalreform.org in English, and we also have an executive summary in Spanish. We will have further language versions of the executive summary to follow in the coming weeks, including French and Russian. This past year has been a unique one for all of us. I'm sure we all agree, but for prisons who were already at crisis point in most countries, with overwhelming numbers of people and underwhelming financial resources available, the challenges and the shifts needed in policy and practices have really been unprecedented. We have seen some common responses shared globally in terms of measures taken. We have had the ups and downs of promises and commitments to release people from prisons, followed often by disappointing lack of action, as countries are continuing now to navigate new waves of the pandemic. Prisons are remaining hotbeds for virus transmission, and new offences for breaching COVID-19 regulations, and also the resumption of court processes in many places, are leading to increases in prison numbers. Within all of this, we see that people in prison have been suffering, and prison staff are struggling too, in disastrous conditions without even the minimum protection or information in many cases. Prison staff have not been considered frontline and continue to fall outside of politicians or health agencies' radars. These are just some of the issues to read about in our report, and today I'm thrilled that we're joined by leading international human rights experts, penal reformers and advocates who will shed further light on the situation that many people are facing in prison today. I warmly welcome all of our panel. And without further delay, I want to turn to our discussion with the panel to hear the insights on a number of the trends that we document in global prison trends. Firstly, with the overuse of imprisonment that has led to dangerous levels of overcrowding when the COVID-19 pandemic hit just over a year ago, there were many calls for people detained for low-level offences, including drug offences, such as drug use, to be released. But we know that at least in 28 countries, release policies excluded such people. And it's against this backdrop that we are honoured to have the wisdom of Ruth Dreyfus open up our discussion today through a video message. Ruth Dreyfus is the former president of Switzerland and, as a member of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, a leading advocate for reform of drug policies.
I would like to start by extending a warm thanks to the team of Penal Reform International and for the important work you do in monitoring the trends in prison systems worldwide. It is a pleasure to speak on behalf of the Global Commission on Drug Policy and have the opportunity to raise attention once again to the disproportionate burden of the repressive drug control system on people who use drugs and low-level actors of the illegal drug market, in particular on women, minorities, and on the most poor, who too often end up in detention centers and prisons. After over a year into the pandemic, the Global Commission welcomes this year's report with a focus on the impact of the pandemic on prison populations and how prisons have responded to these new challenges. The COVID-19 adds up to the many reasons why prisons must be used as a last resort. It has called attention to the condition of our prisons and incited us to question the way to use detention. The pandemic has highlighted overcrowding and the promiscuity conditions resulting from it. During the last year, countries have released thousands of people because of the high risk of the spread of the virus, particularly through dense populated prisons. And not only the risk of contracting the COVID-19 must be shown, but also TB, Hep C, and other transmissible disease. This reveals that many of the released people should not have been in prison at the first place, and that alternative sentences could have been envisaged instead. The report of Penal Reform International shows again this year that the imprisonment of people involved in illegal drug markets, and particularly people who use drugs, continues to be a major contribution factor to prison overcrowding globally, in particular non-violent offenses involving use and possession for personal use. These persons lose their fundamental right of liberty, and they are punished for individual choices of searching through drug consumption, pain relief, other automedication, or even pleasure. Punitive drug laws have led to an estimate 2.5 million people globally in prison sentenced for a drug-related offense, from which 22 are in prison for drug use. Those of them who have dependence problems should be receiving health or social support instead of punishment. Every year, we read about the growing number of people in prisons and the degrading conditions in which they live. Yet, the level of crime in most society is constantly decreasing. Is this the only response we can offer? Where is the proportionality in sentencing when we punish non-violent offenses with lengthy prison sentences? And when we see that it is of no efficacy for reducing the level of drug consumption and the amplitude of drug black markets in societies. The use of harsh prison sentences for people who use drugs or for those who play a minor role in the drug trade shows the inefficacy, limitations, and perverse effects of current drug control policy. Not only are punishment or incarceration becoming the sole instruments used to enforce the law, but they are serving to implement moral norms which have no link with the reality of the behavior that they are supposed to punish. This trend of over-incarceration and punishment of people who use drugs is seen in every continent. The deep impact it has on prison systems and on people in prison and entire communities has sparked the current global debate on drug policy reform. In recent years, more and more countries have been introducing amendments to their drug laws, for example, by decriminalizing the use of drugs in Norway or Colombia, and by replacing prison terms with monetary fine in Ghana and Tunisia, or with community services as envisaged in Senegal. Ecuador gave an amnesty to women caught as drug couriers and released thousands of them. Countries that have traditionally adopted the most harsh stances on drugs, such as Malaysia and Iran, are reviewing death penalty policies for drug offenses and removing people from the death row. That said, these changes and reforms are being discussed and implemented in a global environment that remains highly stigmatizing, where drugs are still considered evil and prohibition approaches prevail. This must change. The need for reform was also highlighted at the UN General Assembly's special session on drugs held in 2016, when member states committed for more proportionate sentencing and alternatives to incarceration. We at the Global Commission on Drug Policy call on countries to implement these commitments, taking into account the fact that over-incarceration as a result of out-of-date drug policy stalls progress on development goals and its implementation, notably for SDG 3 on health, 5 on gender equality, 10 on reducing inequality, and 16 on peaceful societies. The indiscriminate use of prison are counterproductive, costly, ineffective, causes many harms, and has serious economic and social consequences. Drug policies need reform, and there are two urgent ones to enact. First, we need to accept that behaviors and actions of others that are not aligned with our own moral perspectives do not need to be turned into criminal offenses. Drug use behavior must be decriminalized in its entirety. Second, we need to introduce proportionate sentencing and alternatives to punishment, to imprisonment for minor drug supply-related offenses. This will ease pressure on prison systems so that they can fulfill their purpose as set down in the UN Nelson Mandela rules to play a rehabilitative role and focus on social reintegration, and to distance from the criminal justice system those who should not be subject to it, including people who use drugs. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a great discussion today.
Thank you, Ruth Dreyfus, for such wise words, especially a couple of things that I thought to highlight is this need for a shift on our attitudes about what governments are criminalizing in the first place. And this has been an issue that has come up over the past year in regards to regulating the COVID-19 restrictions brought in by every government in the world. And really the question that sticks in my mind from her message is prison the only response that we can offer? And while Ruth was referring to drug use, you know, a major driver of the increasing global prison population is criminalizing offences, or criminalizing behaviour rather, that target the most marginalized and poorest members of our society for quote undesirable behaviour, where there is no threat to public safety. And so on that note, I will now pass the floor to my colleague, Trina Lenihan, who is PRI's Policy and International Advocacy Manager. And Trina is going to share some of the key findings from Global Prison Trends 2021. The floor is yours, Trina.
Thanks, Olivia. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that? Great. So yeah, as Olivia said, I'm really pleased to be sharing the report today, and first want to thank all of the PRI team globally and our many partners and colleagues who have inputted into the report, and including at TIJ. At about 50 pages, I obviously won't be able to share everything with you in the next 15 minutes or so, but I'll try to give a good overview of the key messages and learning, and encourage you all to read the full report on our website. As Olivia mentioned, the executive summary is also available today in English and Spanish, and we'll have more languages coming soon. So to start us off, these figures are based on PRI's analysis of the latest data that was available on the World Prison Brief database as of January of this year. So there continue to be really significant variances in the use of imprisonment across regions and countries. Asia and the Americas currently house about 3/4 of the 11 million people that make up the global prison population. And as we've heard already, this is largely due to punitive drug policies and also using prison as the default response to criminal offending. The rate of imprisonment, so the number of people in prison compared to the general general population, remains the highest in the US, and that's followed by El Salvador and Turkmenistan. The number of women in prison globally has increased by over 100,000 in the decades since the UN Bangkok rules on women offenders were adopted in 2010, which aim to reduce women's imprisonment. And again, there are significant regional variations that you can see, which just sort of exposes the use of imprisonment in response to offences which, as Olivia mentioned, really criminalise poverty, like petty offences, as well as low-level drug-related offences like possession of small amounts of illegal substances, and also status offences which only criminalise women, so for things like abortion, witchery or sorcery. The drivers of the high imprisonment of men and women and overcrowding rates have been relatively stable over the years. Drug policies, as we've mentioned, continue, especially in Asia and the Americas. At least 6 Latin American countries have mandatory prison sentences for non-violent drug offences, even as prisons are already overwhelmed, and we'll hear more about that in a minute. Mandatory sentencing, also a key driver, as well as longer sentences, including an increase in the use of life imprisonment. There are almost 500,000 people serving formal life sentences, and this is still rising. We don't know how many people are serving an informal or a de facto life sentence on top of that as well. And also, as we've mentioned already, the new offences for breaching COVID-19 regulations in many countries have resulted in a variety of sanctions, and they range from fines to different lengths of prison terms. So in some countries, people are being sentenced to short prison terms for violation of quarantines in places like Bahrain, Ireland and Singapore. But in some places it can be much longer. New laws allow up to 3 years in prison in Uzbekistan and up to 20 years in Cambodia under new legislation in March this year. The overuse of pretrial detention has been a long-standing trend in many places and remains a key driver of the rising prison populations. In the 47 countries where more than half of the prison population are untried, 32 of them are operating above their official capacity. And here as well, there's significant regional variation over the last 20 years. So the number of people in pretrial detention has actually decreased in Europe by about 28%, but increased dramatically in the Americas with more than 70% rise, and in Oceania with 225% increase. The use of pretrial detention has still continued in many places during the pandemic, also being automatically applied for a lot of offences. And some of the COVID-19 related arrests have also led to an increase in the use of pretrial detention in some places. Some countries, on the positive side, targeted the pretrial population in COVID-19 relief schemes, and they've had varying levels of success. But some positive examples were seen in Colombia, for example. The pretrial prison population dropped by 43% in 2020, and also in Peru by 17%. Overcrowding levels remain high and are really growing to chronic levels, with occupancy levels as high as 450 or 600% in places like Haiti, the Philippines, and Congo. In the context of the pandemic, overcrowding has really exacerbated the overall poor detention conditions in many countries, especially with regard to like healthcare, access to healthcare, a proper hygiene and appropriate nutrition, which has put many lives at risk. Some countries did reduce overcrowding through a number of measures, particularly in the first peak last year. But overall, this hasn't really made a significant or a lasting dent in the global prison population. So in the first months of the pandemic, a lot of court processes were suspended or reduced, which significantly reduced the intake into prisons. And many countries also announced emergency releases. So combined, those two factors did bring down numbers in a lot of places. So at least 27 European countries reduced their prison population in the first months of the pandemic. And a report from the law firm DLA Piper found at least 475,000 people were released from prisons across 53 jurisdictions in the period from March to July. But there were a lot of barriers to the implementation of those release mechanisms that had been announced, which really limited the effectiveness, particularly in the longer term. So some practical difficulties implementing the schemes, or some changes due to sort of negative public opinion around large numbers of releases, and in some places they were overruled by the courts as well. So some of those barriers are analysed in the report. And now, as well as the pandemic has gone on, we're also seeing increases in prison populations again, as a lot of work is done to clear the court backlogs, which built up when proceedings were suspended last year. So of the 27 European countries I mentioned that had reduced their populations earlier in the year, in the latter part of the year, we saw 12 of those beginning to increase again. But on a positive note, there was a growth in alternatives to imprisonment in response to the pandemic, but the impact of that has varied as well between countries. The ongoing restrictions in place in the community have, of course, caused practical issues implementing some non-custodial sentences, and some services have been really overwhelmed with increases in referrals during the pandemic. So some examples can be seen in Singapore, where they had a 42% increase in the number of people on community corrections than the previous year, and also in the Philippines, where there were 55% more probation supervision cases. So how did children fare in this picture? Some countries did release significant proportions of children from detention, like 30% in Bangladesh, 50% in Albania, and 85% in Sudan. And there's more analysis on the releases in the report. but many countries didn't include children in release mechanisms, and that was largely either because they felt children didn't really face as high a risk of infection from COVID-19, or because in some places children's facilities were less crowded than the adult ones. But children weren't exempted from all the restrictive measures that caused the hardship in detention over the past year, like suspension of in-person visits or limits on education and support programs and severe restrictions on movement throughout the pandemic. So they still have, suffered the impact of these measures as the pandemic has gone on. So now turning to what happened inside prisons over the past year. The starting point is that people in prison are and still remain especially vulnerable to COVID-19, largely because of the cramped living conditions and lack of hygiene supplies in many places, and also generally a poorer health status compared to the general population. And the pandemic has really exposed the existing failure of many prison systems to meet even the most basic standards of healthcare. So the human cost is still quite unknown at this point. Global figures for infection and deaths continue, or because of COVID-19 in prisons, are really limited by what is publicly available. So the true numbers will be much higher, but there are a number of ongoing data collection and transparency issues which are outlined in the report. Again, on this, there are significant differences though between countries because of the differences in availability of testing and also the preventive measures that have been put in place, which are documented in the report. So this has meant some countries have done much better than others in preventing outbreaks and also in collecting and sharing information. The downside, even where prisons have managed to prevent or contain outbreaks, is the impact of the measures that have been in place in some places for over a year now. So many of these measures have increased the isolation of people in prison, and particularly in prisons with cell-based infrastructure, many people or even whole prison populations in some cases have been living in effective solitary confinement for up to a year, which goes against international standards, which limit its use to 15 consecutive days. And that's having a huge impact on mental health. So in previous editions of the Global Prison Trends reports, we've documented the mental health crisis in many prisons globally. And with COVID and all the additional restrictions over the past year, it's really reaching new levels. So we're seeing some data coming through already showing increases in self-harm and suicide rates in some prison systems, which really speaks volumes. But I'll let Professor Hans Wolf go into more detail about that. One important point though is that, like in the community, vaccination of prison populations and staff really has the potential to ease a lot of the restrictions that have had such a negative impact over the past year. We found that at least 13 countries have prioritized prisons in their vaccination strategies, and a further 11 countries have included but not prioritized prisons. But a lot of countries have not specifically referred to prisons at all, which is worrying. And on Monday, PRI will publish a new briefing jointly with the WHO Europe's Health in Prisons Programme and UNODC, which outlines why prioritizing prison populations and staff in the national vaccination programs is so important. Another impact of the pandemic and the responses in prisons is that reports of protests and violent incidents in prisons and even some prison escapes have been linked to the handling of COVID-19. So that includes reaction to the restrictive measures that have been imposed, or a fear of infection among the prison population, and a perceived lack of action by prison authorities. And quite similar to the excessive force that we've seen in crackdowns on protests in the community over the last year, there's been a similar trend in prisons, which has sadly resulted in dozens of deaths and injuries in prisons over the last year, for example, in Colombia, Sierra Leone, and Iran. The restrictions on movement and contact with the outside world in response to the pandemic have hugely impacted the delivery of programs, and that includes probation and post-release support, and also access to healthcare, including mental health care and drug treatment. Training, education and work have also been suspended for long periods of time, or even continue to be in most countries. And in some places, though, rehabilitation programs were able to continue, just with some adaptations or restrictions in terms of numbers or the ways of working, or by moving online. And we've seen really that communication technologies have been installed or expanded to facilitate those programs, as well as contact with families and the provision of telemedicine and other vital services in a lot of places. But implementation and access has varied a lot between countries, and even between prisons within countries, depending on what resources or infrastructure are available. So the positives of that is that it really has offered a lifeline and could be used to supplement in-person services and contact with the outside world going forward. Some of the dangers we see, though, are that while a lot of that is provided freely at the moment, some authorities haven't ruled out charging for them in future. There is also a danger of online replacing rather than supplementing in-person contact, which is so important in terms of rehabilitation and general well-being. And also a deepening of the digital divide. So people in prisons without online access have really been left even further behind over the last year. And the report also includes a new analysis of the situation for prison staff in what has been a really trying year. Prison staff have enjoyed changes in their workloads and conditions, and in some places have even been living or locked down on site for weeks or months, and really faced an increased risk of contracting the virus themselves. So some countries have classified prison staff as essential workers, but overall their situation really hasn't received adequate attention from decision makers. And this comes back to the point as well about vaccination plans and the need to ensure prison staff are prioritised as frontline or essential workers in vaccine rollout, and equally to probation staff who have had real increases in caseload, and also dealing with significant changes to their working conditions. In last year's edition of Global Prison Trends, we examined prison budgets and found that across 54 countries, governments usually spend less than 0.3% of their gross domestic product on prisons, with a few exceptions. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, the resource gap has been stretched even further. And one of the key issues linked to funding is the number of staff available in prisons. In this report, we found that there's a huge range in staff to prisoner ratios globally, and many low-income countries really fail to fund or to fill positions for prison staff. So this year we've seen additional shortages widely reported, particularly, I guess, due to illness or isolation, like mandatory isolation, and changes in organizational structures as well during the pandemic. In some exceptional cases, though, on the positive side, where prison populations did reduce, some staff reported that it made it easier to do their jobs and that relations improved with the people in their facility as well. So we saw that in France and in Florida and the US. Finally, as Olivia mentioned, the special focus of this year's report is on prisons in crisis. So that looks in particular at how the experience of other health crises have been drawn on in places where they've occurred. So, for example, Ebola, and also how countries rebuild after conflict or disaster or prepare for natural hazards, and the use of prison labour in times of crisis, and the contribution really of prison populations in national responses, which we've seen over the last year, mostly in terms of production of masks and PPE, and also in firefighting and other areas. So that's a sort of a whirlwind whistle-stop tour of the report. There's a lot to digest and plenty more detail in the report, but I guess overall, when we reflect on the past year, we're conscious that I guess initially the pandemic brought great hope for more radical change in prisons. And when we met around this time last year, launching the 2020 edition of the report, there was a lot of high-level support and a lot of talk from heads of states around releases and so on. And a lot of that hasn't come to pass, and there are probably different reasons for it. It's possible that the case numbers and deaths in prisons maybe haven't been as high as some people may have feared at the outset. But within that, the cost of preventing the outbreaks has been huge, and the full impact of that will probably only be more fully understood in the years to come. But to end on a more positive note, at the local level, there really have been some positive examples where people have done really good work, and where a humane and health-based approach has been taken to managing the pandemic in prisons, and we've tried to highlight lots of those in the report. So I'll leave it there for now, and look forward to hearing from the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Trina, and congratulations on your leadership in publishing this report, and the work of colleagues at PRI and TIJ, and also we drew a lot on our DEAR network as well. So a big shout out to everybody who's been involved. I should mention that the report this year is available not only as a PDF, but also online. So you can follow the links in the chat to read certain chapters or dive in and out if you're pushed for time today. And we also have a great infographic under our key messages, facts and figures, which navigates some of the kind of key data and key issues that is more of a summary of the report. So I hope that that is useful. Let me remind you also to pose questions or comments using the hashtag Global Prison Trends on Twitter or in the Q&A box. Now I will turn to our next speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Maria Luisa Romero, who is the former Minister of Government in Panama and also a member of the UN Subcommittee on for the Prevention of Torture, the SPT. Maria recently authored a key report on the COVID-19 pandemic and prison policy in Latin America, and found that reforms adopted out of necessity to address urgent needs such as sanitation and overcrowding challenges offer important lessons and overdue policy shifts in the region. So I invite Maria to expand on this. Please take the floor, and thank you.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. I thank PRI for this invitation, and also the Thailand Institute of Justice for making this important report a reality. It's a very impressive piece of work, and I think it's a crucial contribution to the ongoing discussion that we need to be having in the current times about criminal justice reform and human rights in prisons. Although my intervention will focus on Latin America, like Olivia mentioned, it is obvious that many of the facts and concerns are shared by prisons worldwide. And that's why I think that the report that was just presented to us leaves us with very important reflections and with a roadmap to work on how now and in the near future we can continue working to protect the most vulnerable in our justice systems everywhere. I'm going to divide my presentation in three parts. Very briefly, I will present some additional facts and figures to what the PRI report already has to provide some more context. Then I will summarize some of the ways in which Latin American countries responded to the pandemic and the challenges. And finally, I will highlight some key takeaways and reflections on how to move forward, also in line with what the report presented today suggests. So to start off, in Latin America, prisons have suffered from decades of abandonment and official neglect. They have been characterized by deficient health and sanitary conditions, inadequate infrastructure, recurring public health challenges, and widespread and very high levels of overcrowding. To share a few figures to complement what Triana already presented, Latin American rates of incarceration are of the highest in the world. As of September 2018, the world prison population rate was 145 people detained per 100,000 persons. And in South American countries, that rate was 233. And in Central American countries, it was 316. So a lot of imprisonment happening in the region. In many countries, the overcrowding problem is extreme, with overcapacity levels reaching more than 300% in prisons. According to a recent study of the Inter-American Development Bank, around 58% of prisoners in the region do not sleep in beds, which is just one small fact to illustrate the severity of this issue. In terms of sanitary conditions, 29% of the prison population in the region does not receive any type of medical care. 20% of prisoners do not have regular access to drinking water, and only 37% have access to soap. So of course, given this context, it's happened worldwide and discussed at length in the report, in the Global Prison Trends report, the COVID-19 pandemic really exposed and exacerbated these chronic weaknesses in the prison systems in Latin America. One way in which prisons responded in the early stages of the pandemic was, as mentioned by Triana, protesting against the overcrowding, against the lack of hygiene and personal protective equipment, the lack of personal protective equipment available to prevent COVID-19 transmissions. There were numerous violent uprisings that led to tragic consequences. I will mention only a few that happened in March of 2020. In Venezuela, 10 prisoners were killed in recapture efforts after a massive escape. In Colombia, 23 were killed and more than 80 injured in a widespread uprising against the handling of the pandemic. In Argentina, 5 were killed and a dozen were wounded, also in a riot related. And these are just a few examples of how, in addition to the unsanitary and overcrowded prison conditions in the region, prisons were put under heightened pressure and tension due to fear, uncertainty, and definitely poor communication between authorities and those detained. So how did Latin American countries respond to the situation in prisons? Research that I undertook and other institutions have also done shows that in the early months of the pandemic, between March and 2020, Latin American countries adopted a range of policies with the objective of mitigating the public health risks to prisoners and to the broader population, because that was a fear that was very present, how the broader community would be affected. At the most basic level, public authorities attempted to address critical sanitation deficiencies in prisons, and I am referring to extremely basic and long overdue measures, such as increasing food rations, involving solving problems of access to water, undertaking deep cleaning, and promoting health awareness campaigns that involve family members and staff. So all measures that could and should have been taken way before the pandemic. The suspension of visits due to COVID-19, like it was also mentioned in the report, it also forced nations to mobilize. And this was actually surprising and welcoming. Many countries in the region improved communication between prisoners on the outside world through improved and more telephone communication, video conference, to supplement not only the suspended visitations, but as was mentioned also by Triana, other types of rehabilitation programs. And this was definitely an innovation in most prisons in the region. But most significantly, and something that has been discussed, were, I think, the measures and the processes to reduce the overall prison population through many different types of measures. So there were judicial measures taken by courts, legislative and executive measures. They included requests or advice from the judiciary to judges to reassess pretrial detentions, adoption of alternative sentencing measures such as early release or house arrest, and the more traditional presidential pardons. The impact of these measures, as PRI's report also concludes, is difficult to measure. Definitely in the region, there is inconsistent or incomplete information. But notwithstanding, the research suggests that prison releases in response to COVID-19 were likely less than 5% of the overall Latin American prison population, and in a short, limited period. Definitely more research is needed here. In some cases, and as also mentioned in PRI's report, there were efforts, there was a lot of political and judicial pushback presented, which varied. Definitely public opposition to prisoner releases that led to successful challenges in courts in Argentina and Brazil. There were also very legitimate concerns in some countries in the region that the prison releases would lead to impunity in serious cases of human rights violation and corruption. That also happened both in South America and Central America. And one that is highlighted also in PRI's report, which I think is very important to keep in mind, is that without effective reintegration efforts, that sometimes prisoners would literally rather not leave prison. And this happened very explicitly in Chile, where 100 prisoners rejected the general pardon that they received because they did not want to lose the jobs that they had in prison. Having said all this, I do want to end in a positive note and highlight the window of opportunity that I think the pandemic has opened to work towards more humane prisons and criminal reform in the region and, of course, worldwide. And that is because many of the policy measures that were adopted out of necessity during the pandemic were considered politically unpalatable, like really considered impossible. This is something that has been overemphasized by international organizations and by NGOs in the region, and efforts to reduce imprisonment and to provide alternative measures had never been considered and pushed in the way that they were during the pandemic, which is why I really believe, and that's the point that we make in the report that I authored, that that this should lead to further discussion and motivate countries to continue working along those lines. I think that in the same way that PRI's report highlights, this crisis can and should change public attitudes towards imprisonment. It was made glaringly clear in Latin America that with the pandemic, we need a starting point for a new type of reform. I think the pandemic definitely showed how prisons and society are intrinsically interdependent and face shared risks as well as responsibilities. Two examples of this was the fear that communities felt about how the pandemic crisis in prisons could affect them, and also how prisoners in the region were working, making masks and other type of equipment that was necessary for the pandemic. So I think emphasizing that we are all interrelated and interdependent is important in the policy changes that need to happen. So I will leave you with a few points to continue this discussion, and hopefully that will provide a framework for this new policy making. Like the report, PRI's report emphasizes, communication strategies and policy design should really emphasize the reality highlighted by COVID, that prison health is public health. I think this is the point that we need to make stronger. The other one is that states showed that they can mobilize to reduce imprisonment and overcrowding. So we really need to follow on that because definitely important measures were taken. The third one is that technology can and should be used to complement important limitations in prisons. And I say complement because it should never replace human contact. But I think there were some very good examples that show a roadmap as to how it can help address some of the limitations that people deprived of liberty face in prisons. And definitely that we need greater transparency as to numbers and to the impact that COVID had in the region and in the world, because it is that transparency and that research that will allow us to inform policy making. And finally, like PRI's report suggests, further research and discussion is needed about the impact of the pandemic and the policies taken. That's why I welcome this discussion today. And I think that the role that international organizations and that organizations like Penal Reform International play in pushing this discussion and in motivating states and in providing a roadmap for policymaking is really very important to not lose the very important window of opportunity that I think that the pandemic has opened for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's quite a stark picture, but I'm happy to hear that there is the feeling shared that there is reform possible as perhaps a side effect or an impact of the pandemic. And I just want to reiterate your point around the lack of information and data and transparency, which is not just seen with this pandemic, but also just broadly when we are researching issues for global prison trends and our work generally. Prisons have remained quite closed institutions in terms of publishing information. Even if they have come a long way in opening doors to different actors, including monitoring bodies. Our report shows that over 80 countries have not even got adequate data on the number of cases of COVID among their prison populations, which is quite shocking if you're going to be able to respond to the COVID crisis in the first place. So thank you. I now turn to our next speaker, Professor Hans Wolf, who is the Vice President of the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture. Hans, we're really grateful for your time today to speak about the impacts of the pandemic on the health and mental health of people in prison. We are very concerned, as you have heard, around especially the mental health impacts given the restrictions and measures in place to prevent COVID outbreaks. So I invite you to take the floor to give us your insights. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia, and also to Triana for inviting me to this session. It's a pleasure to participate in the launch of this very important report. So I will talk, as Olivia said, about health in prison. That's next topic, please. Next slide, sorry. To speak about, no, before. To speak about health in prison, then COVID in prison, and to finish with mental health issues and COVID in prison. So this combination. Next. Next slide, yeah. As the fundamental principles are formulated by CPT and also in many other, you find them also in many other texts are shown here. So these 7 principles are really important also, and in particular related to this COVID crisis. And we see this when we go with the CPT to the different prisons or places of detention in the Council of Europe area, which includes the 47 countries. Next. I want to pick out 2 principles. The first is the equivalence of care, and to stress that this principle is not based on an equality approach, so the same for everyone. It is really based on a needs-based approach, which means equity. So people who need more deserve more and receive more. This is a fundamental principle of most social insurance systems. And this is particularly important for prison and for this vulnerable population we found there. Next. And the second principle I wanted to point out is the independence of healthcare services in prison. This report done by UNODC and WHO stresses this and gives more insight in this topic, which means that prison health services should be completely independent of prison administration and let liaise effectively with them. So there is not only the independent, but also the cooperation, which is also very fundamental, especially in such a crisis like the COVID. Next. So now, next, I come to COVID. And next slide, please. And to show you this important publication of Williamson in the Nature last year. So this is associated factors with COVID-19 death. It was cut somehow, this word. It's important to consider this. This publication is important because it not only focuses on medical risk factors, but also social risk factors. I underlined in red the deprivation issue. And when you compare, for example, the risk to die of COVID, you have this dotted line in the middle, which means a hazard ratio of 1, meaning no increased risk between the groups. And on the bottom line, you see the risk increases to 2, 5, and 10. And all on the top, you see age is the most important factor, which increases by more than 10. The death risk for to die of COVID infection if you are 80 years or older. But when you come back to the deprivation, you see it is comparable to diabetes. So the more you are deprived and you suffer of multiple deprivation, you will have an increased risk of death of COVID. So COVID is clearly associated to vulnerability, to social vulnerability. Next. Next, please. Yeah. And this is what happens in prison. This is US data published last year. And you see the yellow or orange dotted line is the infections per 100,000 Americans outside prison. And the black line, which leaves the red line and increases very sharply, is the US prison population infected by COVID per 100,000. And this increasing gap continues until now. Next slide, please. And this is a publication of the New York Times some weeks ago, where you see the states in America, the different American states of the US, showing the case rate in the entire state and in prison. And you see this widening and very important gap, which touches almost every state in the US. So COVID is particularly linked to prison. Next. And here you saw this already. So this Triana showed us, this comes from the today published report. It is clear that COVID-related deaths happens almost everywhere. We have a severe lack of data related to what happens, and also what are the measures taken in prison. We know that there is an important impact on mental health. I will show you some more data on this. And also deaths happened related to violence. And this happened almost everywhere. One of the first riot was in Italy, to my knowledge, and then it swept over. It happened also in Latin America quite rapidly. And also the staff exhaustion, which is important to address. Next slide. And the isolation issue is important because in many countries, isolation or COVID-related measures were de facto isolation of the person, and this could also be used, for people who are less visible all of a sudden, or have less visitation because there were bans. And this is of concern to human rights, in particular of the work to CPT, to see these people, which is now very up to date, or which is discussed now, are the vaccination plans related to prisons. And we know that very little countries have a priority given to prisoners, and and very little vaccination plans really exist in prison. There is a debate also in many countries that prisoners should be the least prioritized, just to somehow, for populist reasons, ensure the greater public, which is absolutely wrong, because, as I showed before, this is a vulnerable population which needs priority measures, also related to protection measures and also vaccination. Next, please. And all these measures, isolation, and also the considering that prison population suffers a higher mental health burden, makes this cocktail somehow explosive. The mixture between vulnerability, between isolation related to COVID, the decrease of contacts and activities with the outside world, and also with other prisoners, the hampered rehabilitation work, also the slowing of judicial procedures, worsened the pre-existing mental health disorders. And we see this, for example, in our prison in Geneva, that the self-harm rates increased between December and March. When we compared this to the 5 previous years, it tripled. And the only factor which changed was the COVID crisis. Next slide. This, for those who don't know, this is an important publication showing the mental health burden in prison, comparing, and you see this in the different columns, for males and females separated, the mental health burden inside and outside prison. Next, please. And the actions taken, this is the left slide is from last year's PRE report. On the right side, there were many publications from different international organizations, also this important joint statement. Next slide. And also from the Council of Europe, there was a statement of principles in March 2020, which included or which called upon the states to develop alternative measures to deprivation of liberty. To, if they apply restrictive measures, they have to have a legal basis. They must be proportionate, respectful of human dignity, and limited in time. Access to healthcare, in particular for vulnerable groups, must be ensured. Their fundamental rights must be ensured. And the contact with the outside world needs, if possible, to be held and could not be closed, and compensation were needed if restrictions were necessary. And I must say, I have visited many countries since March last year with the CPT, and we see in many countries also very innovative measures which were never possible. For example, Skype communication or voice over internet communication. With some countries managed to set this in place, others still say it's impossible. So there were opportunities and really good and positive steps which came out of this crisis. Next. And to conclude, this concentration of people with social vulnerability puts them at high risk for COVID. And as they also concentrate all diseases, we generally consider a factor of 10, so 10 times more illnesses for a same aged population in prison compared to the outside. And this is not only for mental health, this is also for other illnesses. This vulnerability is important and concentrates also in prison. We have what already was mentioned, the overcrowding issue, the mental health issue, which calls for a good quality of healthcare, which is often not delivered. And moreover, this sets really a threat to human rights, fundamental human rights. Therefore, also, we have to look what happens in the prison, and this calls for good data in prison. I want also to cite Winston Churchill. I like this phrase, never waste a good crisis. And we saw that opportunities came out of this crisis. And as Maria told you, this public health or prison health is public health, or public health is prison health. This is more, this is as actual as when it was first formulated about 30 years ago. The next slide. And thank you very much for your attention. And with this beautiful issue, or this was Geneva.
Geneva. Thank you. And thank you also for your work and the committee's guidance over the past year, which has been very welcomed and much needed. I think I just want to reiterate, as you aptly describe it, the explosive cocktail of measures and COVID impacts that have had on people in prisons' mental health. I'd say this urgently needs to be addressed as restrictions continue to be in place in many countries. Moving on to our final speaker, the past year has not only shone a light on prison conditions, but also the discrimination faced by many people in criminal justice systems. In May last year, we had protests worldwide about the killing of George Floyd in the US, and we have also been shining a light on the discrimination experienced by women in prison during and pre the pandemic. So to speak about challenging this discrimination, it's really my pleasure to introduce our final speaker, Donna Hilton, who is an author, a criminal justice activist, who spent 27 years in an American prison. Donna, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that, Olivia. Thank you. And then hello, everyone, and thank you for being with us today. Some of you, it's kind of like nighttime, I think, right? It's closer to evening, so good evening to those of you. I just want to thank, I'm really honored to be a part of this panel with my fellow panelists here. And I just want to thank you all for the reports, what you told everyone, the information that you were able to gather. You know, even though it's not easy, it's very difficult. And we should all really understand why it's so difficult. I kind of know the system now, like the back of my hand, growing up in it, unfortunately, for 27 years, how the system in itself is not transparent because they do not treat anyone. Prisons, there are no prisons or jails that are pretty or nice, humane. There are none that exist like that, none that we've seen. Even the European prisons that, you know, some of my colleagues have seen and I know about, whatever, we have to understand the dynamics of them, right? And so, unfortunately, for those in America and in other countries, prisons are created as a tool to continue a racist agenda. Like, that's just really what it is. And to your point, Olivia, what you were saying when you kicked us off, how drug use and mental health are penalized and also weaponized, right? And so therefore they're criminalized. And we must understand that this is all well thought out and there are specific targets for this. Unfortunately, when I was in New York State's maximum security prison for women, what I recognized early on were that the women that had severe mental health issues or whatever mental health issues was not treated. There was no treatment, even though we had a mental health division in the prison, but it wasn't treated. What happened and continues to happen instead, our women are sent to, and people are sent to solitary confinement as treatment. So instead of treating the issue, treating the root cause, you now found a way to criminalize it even more and to punish it even more. And this is the same with drug use. I don't understand, and I don't think any of us here would understand how drug use is something to be criminalized. But right now in America, we have an opioid crisis, and so it has become a public health crisis because it has hit our white communities. We have soccer moms and the like addicted to heroin and other drugs. And so now it's a crisis and it's a public health issue and we must address it, but not criminalize it and not punish it and not send people into prison, right? And so what I'm leading into is that the overwhelming majority of people in our system, criminal justice system, criminal legal system, are Black and brown people. And when I was in the system, I was sent to solitary confinement. I was sent to solitary confinement. And the vast majority of the women inside with me and the young women were Black women. Black women. Either they had most of them had a mental health problem or a drug use problem, whatever. It wasn't something that needed to be criminalized or punished. It was something that needed to be treated. But I kept seeing that pattern happen over and over again throughout the 27 years. I think throughout the entire time, I remember maybe two white peers being inside, 2 or 3, the most. And that it was telling. It was telling. And we continue to see that outside in society. We continue to see how certain communities of color are so-called $1 million blocks, and that's what they're called in New York. We have communities of color that the vast majority of people within our prison system come from these communities, and they just so happen to be Black, just so happen to be brown, just so happen to be people of color. And that's telling. And so we continue to see this pattern throughout, and it is not being addressed. And we know that that's going to be a struggle to get it to be addressed because, let's be very clear, the prison system in this country, and we know everything that's done in this country is modeled across the world, right? People follow what happens in the United States. And so we're going to continue to follow the cruel and inhumane treatment of people because this country is so good at doing that. And so it's modeled everywhere that we go. And we're going to continue seeing this. And so what we have is a system that we know is well thought out and created to incarcerate because Black people, let's be very clear, Black people are considered 3/5 of a human being. And it has become the response to lynching and Jim Crow and all these other things that we've had in this country and we continue to have. When you talked about George Floyd, the knees and the necks of people. The criminal legal system has been a knee in the neck of Black people for eons, decades upon decades. And it will continue to be that way until we recognize and acknowledge and accept the fact that is a racist system and it was designed to do exactly that. There, no way can we really truly be honest with ourselves and say, yes, well, a person has a drug addiction, so when we send them to prison, that's the best thing for them. The person has a mental health issue, the best thing for them is prison. What this country did in the 90s, the early 90s, was take away all the mental health, most of the mental health facilities, and I'm sorry, prison is calling me right now. So forgive me if I'm here trying to get my colleagues to get this call. This is what happens in this work. I'm at work. But what we continue to see is that because they closed the mental health facilities and these other treatment centers, prison has become the response, and it continues to be that way. But it continues to be that way for only certain communities and certain people. And Black women, we get it most. We get it more harsher than even our male counterparts, our Black male counterparts. And so it's telling how we're fighting for the overall humane treatment and conditions of people, of Black people, inside the system and outside of the system. Right now during COVID, we've been responding to it as much as we can, because it was at the beginning of it, when all the, everything was shut down, there was no movement, that no one thought about people eating, getting food, or even having PPE in prison. But guess who was making the PPE and the sanitizer? People in prison. And so the people doing the work were the people who weren't able to use and have the same protective measures as everyone else. Something's wrong there, something's wrong. And no one thought that that was strange. No one thought that that was wrong. And so we had to fight for that. And what we did also was respond by getting PPE to the prisons and food. They're pregnant women, they're babies inside. And so we have to think about these things. And then we were thinking, so what's going to be the protocol? What's the measures that they're going to take to make sure that everyone is safe? Again, there is no way that anyone in a prison or any detention center can, I mean, not just isolate, but they do isolate you, but be able to distance and to have any safety. It is a packed sardine-like situation. When you are in prison and they have dormitories, you have beds on top of beds next to each other. There's no social distancing, there's nothing like that. So how could we not think about the people that are inside these centers, these detention centers and these prisons, and think that they will not be harmed? They would not be, be susceptible to this virus.
Sorry, Donna, one more minute. Sorry to interrupt.
So, okay, I'll wrap it up. So, and I just want to say that the vast majority of the women inside, and Black women, not just mental or substance abuse, but there's medical stuff as well. There's basically subpar treatment within the communities that I'm talking about, if there are any medical support there at all. And so prison, you go to prison to try to get medical care, that doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. So I'm thankful that you all are here listening to us and understanding that we have no humane or pretty or nice or equitable prison in this world at all. And we must understand that women get it worse and Black women are treated less than. And we need to stop this practice because it is wrong. It is wrong. It is inhumane, and we must stop doing this. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Donna. And I think everybody can hear your passion, and I completely share your views in terms of inequality, and using the word inhumane is very helpful to remind us of what we're talking about today, in terms of detaining people in conditions that are substandard and definitely below minimum standards in international law. Thank you to all of you who have engaged with us in our conversation today. We were joined by over 200 people, and I hope that it gives rise to further thoughts and ideas on how we can address the urgent issues at hand, but also longer term reform that's needed so desperately. I first want to give the floor to Dr. Fizit Sardan, the Executive Director for the Thailand Institute of Justice, to give us some closing remarks. And then I hope that we will have time for a couple of questions to the panel that have been posed. As usual, we have run out of significant time, but we can fit all of this in. So please go ahead, Dr. Fizit, and take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Good evening to all of you from Bangkok. I'm Piset Sarden, and I am the Executive Director of the Thailand Institute of Justice. It is a great honor for me to be able to say a few words at the closing of this launching event of the Global Prison Trends Report of the 2021. First and foremost, I would like to thank all the distinguished panelists for their insightful presentations. I would also like to thank all of you in the audience who have taken the time to attend this virtual launch. The 2021 report came in at the critical moment, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank our partner, Penal Reform International, and all the experts involved for putting out such a timely and insightful report. Since 2017, we at the THJ have enjoyed an excellent partnership with the PRI, which has led to several exciting projects. And I look forward to our continued collaboration to bring us closer to our common goal, that is to support governments and all the key stakeholders in creating a more resilient and equitable criminal justice system. Just a brief note about the THJ. We have been created in 2011 to serve as the Research, Policy, Advocacy, and Capacity Building Institute by the Thai government. In 2015, we became affiliated with the United Nations as one of the institutes that comprise the UN Crime Program Network, or PNIs. One of our primary goals is to promote the use of the standards and norms related to crime prevention and criminal justice, not only in Thailand, but also in our region, the ASEAN region, and beyond. A key element in any effort to create a fair, humane, and inclusive justice system lies in knowledge creation and dissemination so that we can all learn from each other as a global community. And the Global Prison Trends Report serves this particular purpose by precisely providing a comprehensive resource that explores trends, challenges, and opportunities in prison policy and practices worldwide. This resource benefits stakeholders in and outside the justice system. The year 2020 and probably the first half of this year as well were unprecedented, that tested our resilience as individuals as well as a community. As the devastation unfolds, it has become very clear that the impact of the pandemic has been harsher on certain sections of our society than others. We are talking about the vulnerable group and who are the persons deprived of their liberty. With overcrowded and under-resourced prisons in many countries, these people have been made to become a breeding ground for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. More death, further deprivation, and increased human rights violation followed. Hence, the Global Prison Trends put a spotlight on the COVID-19 and its impact on criminal justice system globally. This year edition on the special focus also looks into other crises that prison might face, which include natural disasters, conflict, and health emergency, so that we can all learn about ways to increase our preparedness and responses, for which I'm very thankful. Our panelists today have already touched upon very key important issues, and I will not repeat them. What I want to do finally is to just pick up some of the points that have been made, and would like to leave all of you with a few observations of my own as we look towards the future. First, it has become clear that prisons, when overused, do not serve the purpose of rehabilitation. And second, a key ingredient of criminal justice reform, post-COVID or not, would be to prioritize and to try to increase the use of non-custodial measures. And only then we can ensure that the proportionate use of criminal sanctions and the right-based effective criminal justice system is in place. We will not be able to achieve a transformation like that without a multi-stakeholder engagement, and we need to build partnerships across sectors. To create a long-term and sustainable change, we all need to work together to break the cycle of offending. We need to give people a second chance at life without prejudice. It is not going to be easy, but it is possible. By putting the voices of those deprived of their liberty at the center of our work, and by putting rehabilitation and inclusiveness at the core of the criminal justice reform, we become one step closer to creating a more humane system that serves the people in it. And THJ stands ready to support our partners around the world in this endeavor. And with that, I conclude my remarks, and I thank you very much for your kind attention. And over to you, Olivia.
Thank you so much, Fizit, and also for our ongoing cooperation. The dream team, I call it, at PRI with regards to global prison trends. There are a couple of questions if people have time to stay on, and of course, I do want to thank you if you have to log off now at 1:30 for joining us. But first of all, perhaps this one could be answered by Maria, if I can volunteer you. Somebody has asked, considering the dire situation across detention in Latin America, and I think we can say in many regions, as well as some of the barriers to implementation of alternatives that were mentioned, what do you think could be done to broaden the use of non-custodial measures?
Thank you, Olivia. And yes, I think my answer probably applies to all the regions. But I think it's important to realize that there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to this question. And I think this is the most relevant question, at least for me, what happens now. But I think that we have to realize that at least in the region, countries vary tremendously in their legal framework, as well as in the use and implementation of non-custodial measures. And this was before and during the pandemic. So that's why I think it is so important to have more information, transparency, and research on what exactly were the bottlenecks that countries experienced, whether it was the lack of legal framework, whether it was a bureaucratic challenges, whether it was resistance from the judiciary, challenges in reintegration, and then go from there, because there will be some that are common to many countries, and then there will be some challenges that are specific, but we need to have that plan. And then, like I mentioned, one general measure that I think that we need to work on in general is working to create more public conscience, capitalizing on what the pandemic exposed regarding the need for more humane prisons, and also what Ruth Dreyfus highlighted, that many of the people who were released should not have been in prisons in the first place. So I think communication strategy has to work in parallel fashion to the push for policy shifts.
Thank you. Thanks, Maria. Another question is around releases versus keeping people in prison if there's healthcare available. So Trina, I think you might be fit to answer this one. It reads, in light of the second wave that India is facing, there is an argument that releasing prisoners at this point is an act of the state absolving itself of its obligation to ensure the health and safety of prisoners. In this light, would keeping prisoners in an overcrowded space where infected people are provided healthcare preferable to releasing vulnerable prisoners?
Thanks, Olivia. Yeah, I can see the basis for the argument, but I think overall it's around the priority being to prevent outbreaks or to prevent as many infections as possible. So I think due to the levels of overcrowding and the cramped conditions in prisons, it's preferable, I would say at this point, to ease overcrowding, to allow for distancing within prisons, and the state responsibility in terms of providing protections and healthcare, particularly in response to COVID, but generally doesn't end when people leave prison. I think the issue is probably more around there not being adequate support when people leave and in the community as well, rather than, you know, it being preferable to remain in prison. I think it's been mentioned already, cases where people, I guess, can have the option to refuse release, but I think in the most part, people would be more inclined to have that sort of autonomy and self-determination to take the actions that you desire to protect yourself in the current situation, rather than being in a cramped space where you really have no control over your own protection from the virus. So the general guidance from international bodies, including like WHO, UNODC, PRI, and even the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from the outset, has been really to prioritize releases and reducing prison populations and overcrowding. So I think that still stands, but with the caveat that, you know, people should be provided adequate support when they leave. I think in the Indian context in particular, we saw in the first peak as well earlier last year, where some people were released without adequate support, even in terms of, you know, transport and getting home and having to travel long distances, in breach of the regulations then in the community as well, and not being provided enough information and support to follow the regulations in the community when they are released. Yeah, so I think it's more to encourage the releases, but provide adequate support in doing so.
Thanks, Trina, and thank you all for engaging today. I will just end on a couple of notes before thanking everybody. We've heard today that the challenges faced by prisons have been compounded by decades of inadequate funding and, I guess, political will to reform criminal justice systems. And the pandemic has exposed the impact of overcrowding and under-resourcing in the gravest of terms. And that is through the loss of life that we have seen among prison populations, and the number of cases among people in prison and also prison staff, and also the loss of human rights in many cases. And so again, I want to conclude by saying that we need to learn from this experience of this pandemic, and it's not too late to stop the harms that have been caused by measures that continue to be in place in many detention centres, or to protect the people that are most vulnerable to COVID. So it will be up to advocates like us at PRI and many of you who have joined us today to continue our work to ensure that the good measures are taken up, continued and replicated in this ongoing response to coronavirus and also in new crises. So thank you all so much for joining our participants, and also to our esteemed panel for their insights. And we hope that our report serves as a useful resource to not only understand the trends, but also to serve as a tool for change in our advocacy work to build better, more effective criminal justice systems. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you on another event or in person soon.